God made mothers. He made one for his son. Even though Jesus was the Son of God, Mary impacted his life as his mother. On the cross, he thought of her. His concern for her directly follows the recording of the soldiers dividing his clothing among themselves, as we read in John 19, verses 23 and 24. When the soldiers crucified Jesus, they took his clothes, dividing them into 4 shares, one for each of them, with the undergarment remaining. This garment was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. "Let's not tear it," they said to one another. "Let's decide by lot who will get it." This happened that the scripture might be fulfilled that said, "They divided my clothes among them and cast lots for my garment." And in so doing, those soldiers unknowingly fulfilled messianic prophecy. 1,000 years before the time of Christ, David prophesied about the crucifixion of the Messiah. And among the predictions of his hands and his feet being pierced and people mocking him and challenging him to save himself, David predicted what the soldiers would do. We see that in Psalm 22, verse 18, when it says, "They divide my garments among themselves and throw dice for my clothing." 4 articles of clothing were divided among 4 soldiers. But when they saw the undergarment and saw that it was seamless, they considered it too valuable to cut into fourths. So they gambled for it. That undergarment was a knee-length robe woven in one piece. There were no seams. It was not sewn together. It was made of finer material than the coarse outer robe that the Jewish people wore at that time. Probably it was linen. Seamless robes were not common. Josephus, the first-century Jewish historian, wrote that priests wore robes like that, but few others did. So this garment had value, and they therefore gambled for it. Jewish mothers, tradition tells us, would weave an undergarment for their sons as they reached adulthood and set out on their own. That little fact reminds me of the mothers of the 1950s and 1960s who always advised their children, "Make sure you put on clean underwear before you leave the house. You might get in an accident and have to go to the hospital." Are you familiar with that bit of motherly wisdom? I never understood it. If I were in an accident so serious that I had to be transported to the hospital, the condition of my underwear would be of my least concern. But this cartoon suggests differently. "Mrs. Jacobs, your son was in an accident, and I'm sorry, but he's wearing dirty underwear." No, why? Apparently, mothers have this fascination with their children facing the world in good, clean underwear. Maybe that began with the mothers of ancient Israel. And so it was that Mary likely wove that undergarment for Jesus, for which the soldiers gambled. And as he watched that take place on the cross, his thoughts, therefore, turned to her. And from the cross, he addressed her. And he made provision for her, as we see in verses 25 through 27 of our text in John 19. Near the cross of Jesus stood his mother, his mother's sister, Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, and by the way, that was John. John in his gospel always addressed himself or referred to himself in the third person. When Jesus saw his mother there and the disciple whom he loved standing nearby, he said to her, "Woman, here is your son." And to the disciple, "Here is your mother." From that time on, this disciple took her into his home. We learn 2 lessons about motherhood from the cross of Jesus. The first of those is that godly moms stay near Jesus. We saw that about Mary, didn't we, in verse 25. Godly moms stay near Jesus. They will take the sometimes unpopular stand with him. And Mary was there with Jesus at the cross, devoted to him. And of course she would be devoted to him. After all, he was her son. But he was also her Lord, and she understood that. She had always been committed to God's will. That's the kind of woman that she was. That's why God chose her to be the woman who would bring the Messiah into the world. And when the angel Gabriel came to Mary as a young virgin engaged to Joseph and told her that she would bear the Son of God, she committed herself to God's will, as we read in Luke chapter 1. The angel said to her, "Do not be afraid, Mary. You have found favor with God. You will conceive and give birth to a son, and you are to call him Jesus. The Holy Spirit will come on you, and the power of the Most High will overshadow you. So the Holy One to be born will be called the Son of God." "I am the Lord's servant," Mary answered. "May your word to me be fulfilled." She was committed to God's will. And so there at the cross she stood. She was in the minority. She pronounced with her presence a dangerous affiliation with Jesus. Peter had feared that affiliation, and so hours earlier he had denied even knowing Jesus. The other disciples also feared that affiliation. When Jesus was arrested, they scattered and hid, and they were not to be found at the site of the crucifixion. But Mary stayed near Jesus, along with just a handful of others. She was loyal to him to the end, staying near him even in a hostile environment. Moms, in this increasingly ungodly world, you will be called upon to stand with Jesus. And you will often find yourself in the minority doing so. But you stand with Jesus. Stand with him and refuse to allow your children to watch movies which contain profanity and crudeness and lewdness. Stand with Jesus and reject the changing cultural standards. Affirm for them that God's truth is universal and his morality will always be. Affirm for them that gender is God-given, for instance, and not chosen. And marriage is defined by God as being between one male and one female and nothing else. Stand with Jesus and teach your children about God's church. Teach them that it is more important than sports. Teach them that it is your family's weekly practice of faith. Teach them that God's church is his plan for your lives. Stand with Jesus and teach your children to dress in modesty and to behave in godliness. Stand with Jesus and teach your children to have faith even when they do not understand, to continue trusting in God. You are needed, moms, to demonstrate that kind of devotion to Jesus. To model for your children staying near him and being committed to his will, so that your children will learn that and live that and teach that to their children as well. Stand with Jesus, even when it is difficult. When Jesus was dedicated at the temple just after his birth, Simeon, a prophet, was there that day. God had given him a special message that he was to pass on to Mary. It was a message about the pain she would experience as the mother of the Messiah. And so Simeon told her, "Your pain will be as though a sword was piercing your heart." And as Mary stood there at the cross that day, it certainly must have felt like that. For there may be no greater pain a woman could experience than that of attending the death of her own child. It is not the natural order of things. Mary's pain was unnaturally excruciating. I wonder, as she watched him being crucified, did she remember holding those hands now nailed to the cross when they were little? Did she recall kissing that forehead that was now impaled by thorns? Did she long to comfort him as she often did when he got hurt as a little boy? Did she have to restrain herself against her strong maternal instincts to try to rescue him from his suffering? Did she pray for divine help or for a quick death to end his agony? And as the spear pierced the heart of her son, did Simeon's words, spoken 33 years earlier, come back to her? Her arms had cradled him in infancy. They would cradle him in death. And Mary watched in torment. She did not intervene, likely because she knew that her son had been born for a different purpose than any other. This was his moment. She trusted God's plan, even though when it brought her terrible pain. And as a mother is ever teaching, Mary teaches us the depth of faith. Trust God's will. Yield to it, even when following it is difficult. Yield to it when we prefer a different path. Yield to it and stand with Jesus, even when that is a painful thing to do. Godly moms do that. They stay near Jesus and near his will. There's a second lesson about motherhood that comes to us from the cross of Jesus. Godly moms stay near Jesus, and secondly, godly mothers are to be honored. They hold a special place in our hearts. American humorist Irma Bombeck experienced that. She wrote about that experience several years ago, saying, "For my first 4 to 5 years of child raising, I considered motherhood a temporary condition, not a calling. It was a time of my life set aside for exhaustion and long hours, but it would pass. Then one afternoon, I took my three children to the supermarket, and while I was pushing the cart outside, my toddler son got away from me. He ran toward a bubblegum machine, shouting, 'Gimme, gimme!' I told him I would give him something if he didn't get back in that car. I tried to pry his body from around the bubblegum machine, and he pulled it over. The glass dome shattered, and bubblegum balls rolled all over the parking lot. We had now attracted a crowd. I threatened him with punishment. He began to sob as he looked at all those staring faces. And then he did something that I will remember the rest of my life. He turned to the only one he trusted for comfort, me. He threw his arms around my knees and held on for dear life. I had humiliated him, chastised him, and berated him, but I was still all he had. That single incident defined my role. I was a major force in this child's life. I wonder, as Jesus looked down upon Mary from the cross that day, did he look for some kind of comfort from her? Did he remember from his childhood those tender hands that cupped his sobbing face when his feelings were hurt? That soothing voice that chased his nightmares away. Those loving arms that swept him up out of danger. Did he remember the gentle spirit that put him at ease in times of distress, or the comfort that she gave that made all of his pains disappear? And I wonder, did he long for some of that comfort from her in that moment? Jesus had a special place in his heart for his mother. For on the cross, in his agony, he thought of her. It was his most crucial moment of life. He was in the most severe pain he had ever felt. He experienced his only separation from God. He was on his most important mission, fulfilling his divine appointment, carrying out the greatest objective in human history. And his thoughts turned to his mother. He saw to her welfare and appointed his most loving disciple to take care of her. He honored his mother. This is a day to honor your mother. When Solomon wrote about the virtuous woman, the virtuous mother and wife, he, after several verses of describing her attributes and great qualities, he concluded with these words in Proverbs 31, verses 28 and 29. Her children arise and call her blessed, saying, many women do noble things, but you surpass them all. If you are fortunate enough to have your mother still with you, thank her for the special role she has played in your life. Tell her that you love her. If your mother has unfortunately departed this life, live honoring her by living the virtues she taught you. And think of her, giving her credit for how you turned out. Honor your mother. God bless you, moms, and thank you for the sacrifice that you have made to your family and to society, and for the good role that you play in the development of life so that our society can be humane and godly. And may God continue to bless you. May you realize that you have served a very important role, and you have made more of a difference than just being a homemaker or a mom. You are a mother, a developer of lives. May God continue to bless you and watch over you and keep you.